October the 25th, 1415. A field in northern France. 6,000 exhausted, starving Englishmen stand in ankle-deep mud, staring across at an army 4 times their size. A massive French force of perhaps 20 to 30,000 soldiers, men-at-arms, knights, and crossbowmen, the most feared warriors in Europe, gaze back with contempt. The English king, 29 years old, has been marching his dying army for 17 days, desperate to reach the safety of Calais. But now, there's nowhere left to run. The French commanders are already dividing up the English prisoners they'll ransom. French nobles argue over who gets to capture King Henry himself. This isn't a battle, it's an execution. The English are trapped between 3 massive divisions of French cavalry and infantry, each one alone capable of crushing them. Their backs are to enemy territory. There's no retreat, no reinforcements, no hope. But Henry's army has one advantage the French don't understand, a weapon so devastating, so revolutionary, that in the next few hours it will shatter the foundations of medieval warfare forever. The English longbow and the muddy field that's about to become a graveyard for French nobility. What happens next is impossible. In just a few hours the French will lose thousands while the English lose only a few hundred. An entire generation of French nobles will be wiped from existence, and the age of the armoured knight will begin its death spiral into obsolescence. This is the story of how thousands of archers destroyed an army of knights. This is the Battle of Agincourt. If you're ready to witness one of history's most stunning military victories, hit that like button right now. And subscribe to Wars in History. We bring you the most dramatic battles ever fought, told like you've never heard before. Ring that notification bell so you never miss an episode. Now, let's go back to 1415 and watch an underdog army defy all odds. The year is 1415, and England's young king, Henry V, is gambling everything on one audacious campaign. For decades, the 100 Years' War between England and France had simmered in an uneasy truce. French internal politics were fractured. The Armagnac and Burgundian factions tore at each other's throats, while the French king, Charles VI, descended into madness. Henry saw his opportunity. He revived ancient English claims to the French throne and demanded vast territories in France. When the French rejected his demands, Henry assembled an invasion force. On August 13th, 1415, Henry landed in Normandy with approximately 12,000 men, a mix of men-at-arms and longbowmen. His target was Harfleur, a strategic port on the northern coast. Henry needed Harfleur as a permanent English foothold in France, a gateway for future campaigns. But the siege dragged on far longer than anticipated. The garrison resisted stubbornly. Disease ravaged the English camp. Dysentery swept through the ranks, killing hundreds. Food ran short. Morale plummeted. Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, but victory came at a catastrophic cost. Henry's army was shattered. He'd lost nearly a third of his fighting strength to disease, desertion, and casualties. He needed to leave a garrison to hold Harfleur, further depleting his numbers. The campaigning season was nearly over. Winter approached. French armies were mobilizing across the region. The smart move was to return to England, rebuild, and try again next year. But Henry made a different choice, one that seemed suicidal. He decided to march his weakened army across 120 miles of hostile territory to Calais, the last great English enclave on the continent. It was a chevauchée, a raid designed to show that England could still move freely through France despite being outnumbered. It was a challenge to French honour and a test of his own men's courage. Henry believed the march would take 8 days. He rationed food accordingly. Each man carried minimal supplies. The march began in early October with roughly 6,000 to 9,000 men. They moved northeast, paralleling the coast. But French forces shadowed them, blocking the direct route. Henry's men were forced to march inland, adding days to their journey. They reached the Somme River on October 12th, expecting to cross at established fords. But the French had fortified every crossing point. English scouts reported enemy troops dug in at the bridges, ready to slaughter any crossing attempt. Henry had no choice but to march east along the southern bank of the Somme, searching for an unguarded ford. His army trudged through rain-soaked roads. Food ran out. Men ate nuts and scraps foraged from the countryside. Dysentery continued its grim harvest. Exhaustion turned men into walking corpses. Morale collapsed. Soldiers whispered mutinously. They were marching to their deaths. Still, Henry pushed them forward. He had to reach Calais. Surrender meant capture and ransom at best, execution at worst. On October 19th, after a grueling detour, the English finally found an undefended ford near Bethencourt and crossed the Somme. They were now on the northern bank, with Calais less than 50 miles ahead. Hope flickered in the ranks. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe they'd escape this nightmare. But on October 24th, near the village of Agincourt, French scouts brought devastating news. A massive French army blocked the road ahead. The French had caught them. That night the two armies camped within sight of each other. The French were jubilant, celebrating their impending victory with wine and dice games. They argued over who would capture which English nobles, already planning how to spend their ransoms. In the English camp silence reigned. Men confessed their sins to priests, wrote farewell letters, sharpened weapons. King Henry moved among them, speaking quietly to groups of archers and men-at-arms. He told them they would fight at dawn. He told them they would win. Few believed him. October 25th, 1415, the feast of St. Crispin and Crispinian, the day that would change warfare forever. As dawn broke cold and grey over the muddy fields of Agincourt, both armies prepared for battle. The French outnumbered the English at least 3-1, possibly 4-1. Modern historians estimate the English had 6,000 to 9,000 men, with roughly 5,000 being Longbowmen and about 1,000 men-at-arms. The French fielded between 20,000 and 30,000 soldiers. Whatever the exact count, the disparity was overwhelming. The English were exhausted, starving and sick. The French were fresh, well-fed and confident. Everything pointed to a French massacre. But the French had made critical mistakes. They had chosen to fight on a narrow field flanked by thick woods. The battlefield was recently ploughed farmland about 900 yards wide. Heavy rain the night before had turned the ground into a quagmire of sticky clay, and they were about to face the most lethal weapon of the medieval age, the English longbow, wielded by men who'd trained since childhood. The stage was set for one of history's greatest upsets. King Henry positioned his army with tactical brilliance. He placed his men-at-arms, the armoured knights and professional soldiers, in the centre of his line. These men would absorb the main French assault. But the real killing power of Henry's army stood on the flanks. Archers, thousands of them, positioned in wedge formations that projected forward from the main line, creating overlapping fields of fire. Every English archer carried a longbow, a 6-foot weapon made from yew, capable of launching arrows over 250 yards with terrifying accuracy and penetrating power. The longbow wasn't just a weapon. It was the product of a uniquely English military culture. English law required regular archery practice. Men trained from boyhood, developing the enormous strength needed to repeatedly draw a bow with a pull weight of over 100 pounds. A trained longbowman could loose 6 arrows per minute while maintaining this rate for extended periods. Each arrow was heavy and flew at speeds well over 100 miles per hour. At close range, longbow arrows could punch through weaker armour or find gaps in plate. At longer ranges, they devastated horses and men in dense formations, creating chaos and inflicting wounds. Henry ordered his archers to prepare defensive stakes. Each archer carried a sharpened wooden stake about 6 feet long. They hammered these stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a forest of spikes in front of their positions. These stakes served a crucial purpose, stopping cavalry charges. A horse impaled on a stake wouldn't just die, it would thrash and scream, creating a barrier of wounded animals that would block following riders. The stakes transformed the archers from vulnerable skirmishers into a fortified position that heavy cavalry couldn't easily overrun. The battlefield narrowed between the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt, funneling any French advance directly into this killing ground. The French couldn't flank the English position. They couldn't maneuver around the archers. Their only option was to charge straight ahead into the face of 5,000 longbows, and the muddy ground would slow their advance, giving the archers more time to shoot. Henry had turned tactical disadvantage, being trapped with his back against enemy territory, into a defensive strongpoint. Now he just needed the French to attack. The French army was divided into 3 battles, or divisions. The vanguard, commanded by the Constable Charles d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, formed the first line. This division contained roughly 8,000 men-at-arms, heavily armoured nobles, fighting on foot. The French had learned from previous defeats that dismounted knights could better engage English positions than cavalry. Behind them stood the main battle, another large division of men-at-arms. The rearguard, composed of mounted knights, waited further back. 2 small cavalry wings of several hundred horsemen each were positioned to charge the English archers. The French plan was straightforward. Use the cavalry wings to break up the English archer formations, then send in the dismounted men-at-arms to crush Henry's centre. With their numerical superiority and heavier armour, the French believed they'd simply overwhelm the exhausted English through sheer mass. They anticipated light losses. They were already planning the victory celebrations. The Duke of Brabant, so confident of easy triumph, was still donning his armour when the battle began. French nobles jockeyed for positions of honour in the front ranks. Being at the front meant being first to engage, first to capture valuable prisoners, first to earn glory. But the French commanders made catastrophic errors. They underestimated the effect of terrain. The muddy field seemed like a minor inconvenience, not a death trap. They failed to properly coordinate their attacks. The cavalry wings would charge separately from the main body. They crammed too many men into too narrow a space, eliminating their ability to manoeuvre. They ignored the lessons of previous English victories at Crécy and Poitiers, where longbowmen had devastated French cavalry, and most critically, they allowed impatience and pride to override tactical sense. Rather than starving the English out or using their crossbowmen to weaken the English position from range, the French nobles demanded immediate battle. They wanted glory, ransoms, and revenge. They were about to get nightmare instead. Before we watch the battle unfold, I want to tell you about our exclusive Wars in History merch collection. We've designed premium gear featuring iconic battles and warriors from throughout history. Every purchase directly supports this channel and helps us create more epic content like this. Check out the link in the description to grab your Wars in History merchandise today. Now let's get back to Agincourt and watch the killing begin. For 3 hours the armies stared at each other across the muddy field. Neither side wanted to attack first. The French were confident but waiting for stragglers to join their ranks. Henry needed the French to come to him. His defensive position was his only advantage. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, Henry made a bold decision. He ordered his army to advance. The English line pulled up its stakes, marched forward about 300 yards, and replanted the stakes. They were now within bowshot of the French, positioned on slightly higher ground. It was a calculated provocation. Henry's archers drew their bows and unleashed volleys of arrows into the French lines. These weren't massed volleys meant to kill, but harassment shots designed to wound and enrage. Arrows arced across the grey sky and fell among the French ranks. Men screamed as arrows pierced limbs and faces. Horses reared and panicked. The French nobility, already eager for battle, exploded with rage. The English were attacking them. The arrogance of it was unbearable. The French cavalry wings spurred their horses forward, charging toward the English archers. The battle had begun. The cavalry thundered across the field, but within seconds disaster struck. The heavy rain had turned the ploughed earth into thick, sucking mud. Horses struggled to maintain momentum. Their hooves sank deep with every stride, slowing from a gallop to a laboured trot. Now, as hundreds of mounted knights tried to charge, they found themselves fighting the earth as much as the enemy, and all the while English arrows rained down on them. Longbowmen on both flanks drew and released in devastating rhythm. 6 arrows per minute per man, thousands of archers shooting simultaneously. With 5,000 longbowmen firing steadily, tens of thousands of arrows per minute filled the air at the battle's peak. The sky darkened with shafts. French cavalry rode into a storm of wood and steel. Arrows struck horses in the chest, neck, and flanks. The animals screamed and fell, throwing their riders into the mud. Arrows pierced the gaps in armour, visors, joints, necks. Knights tumbled from saddles, drowning in mud under the weight of their own armour. Some cavalry reached the English lines, crashing into the stakes. Horses impaled themselves on the sharpened wood. Others tried to swerve, creating chaos among the following ranks. A few knights managed to dismount and engage the archers in close combat, but they were immediately swarmed and killed. The cavalry charge disintegrated. Wounded horses ran wild, trampling men on both sides. Riderless animals galloped back, toward the French lines, crashing into the advancing vanguard. The first French attack had lasted minutes and accomplished nothing except creating obstacles for the next wave. The French vanguard, 8,000 dismounted men-at-arms in full plate armour, advanced on foot. They advanced in dense formation, visors down, each man carrying dozens of pounds of steel armour. On solid ground they would have been nearly invincible. In the mud they were walking corpses. The earth grabbed at their feet with every step. Men stumbled and fell. Those who fell struggled to rise under the weight of their armour. The formation compressed as men instinctively crowded together for protection. The French advance slowed to an exhausted shuffle, and the English archers kept shooting. Arrows couldn't always penetrate plate armour, but they didn't need to. They struck visors, blinding men. They hit joints where armour plates met. They wounded hands and arms. Most devastatingly, they simply accumulated. A man hit by 5 or 6 arrows, even if none killed him, was wounded, bleeding, and losing strength. The psychological effect was equally crippling. Imagine marching through knee-deep mud while arrows hammer your armour like steel rain. Imagine breathing heavily through a narrow visor, vision restricted, hearing muffled, while men around you scream and die. Imagine the exhaustion of every step, the growing certainty that you won't reach the enemy before an arrow finds a gap. The French vanguard finally reached the English men-at-arms after what must have felt like an eternity. They crashed into Henry's centre with desperate fury. For a brief moment, the battle hung in balance. The English line bent under the impact. Knights fought hand-to-hand in the mud, swords and axes rising and falling. King Henry himself was in the thick of fighting, his royal helmet dented by French weapons. The Duke of Alençon nearly killed him, striking Henry's helmet before being cut down. The melee was brutal, chaotic, and exhausting, but the French couldn't press their advantage. They were too tightly packed to swing weapons effectively. Men tripped over bodies and fallen comrades. The mud prevented proper footing for powerful strikes. And the English archers, seeing the French engaged with their men-at-arms, dropped their bows and joined the fight. Thousands of lightly armoured archers, carrying mallets, hatchets, axes and daggers, flooded into the flanks of the French formation. The archers moved easily over the mud in their lighter gear while French knights floundered. What followed was systematic butchery. The archers attacked with savage efficiency. They struck French knights from behind and the sides, targeting gaps in armour. They used mallets to bash in helmets, crushing skulls. They thrust daggers through visors and into throats. They tripped heavily armoured men and murdered them on the ground before they could rise. The French, trapped in their compressed formation and exhausted from their advance, couldn't defend themselves. They died in heaps. Bodies piled up so high that men climbed over corpses to reach living enemies. The muddy field became a charnel house. The French 2nd Division watched in horror as their vanguard was destroyed. Some units tried to advance to help but became entangled in the retreating survivors and the carpet of dead. Other units simply refused to move forward into that nightmare. The narrow battlefield had become a trap. Dead horses, wounded men, abandoned weapons, and corpses created impassable barriers. The French numerical advantage meant nothing when they couldn't bring their forces to bear. Meanwhile, English archers and men-at-arms methodically worked through the French ranks, killing and capturing. Within hours of the initial cavalry charge, the battle was effectively over. The French vanguard had been annihilated. The 2nd Division had partially engaged and been thrown back. The rearguard, composed of mounted knights who might have made a difference, largely refused to charge into the killing ground. Some French nobles fled, others surrendered, hoping for ransom. The English took hundreds of prisoners. Captured French nobles represented enormous wealth in ransom payments. Henry's men began the grim work of identifying and securing high-value captives while finishing off common soldiers who had no ransom value. Then, late in the afternoon, a French cavalry force was spotted reforming for another attack. Simultaneously, Henry received reports that French soldiers were raiding his baggage train in the rear. Faced with the possibility of a renewed attack while his men were scattered and exhausted, Henry made a controversial decision. He ordered the execution of the French prisoners. English soldiers, many reluctant to destroy their potential ransom fortunes, hesitated. Henry had to threaten his own men with punishment before they complied. Hundreds of French prisoners, nobles who had surrendered expecting honourable treatment, were slaughtered. It remains one of the most controversial acts of the battle, violating the codes of chivalry but arguably necessary from Henry's tactical perspective. The threatened French attack never materialized. As darkness fell, the battlefield grew silent. English soldiers walked among the dead, stripping bodies of armour and valuables, finishing off wounded Frenchmen. The scale of the French catastrophe became clear. Thousands of French fighting men lay dead in that muddy field, including a massive portion of France's high nobility, dukes, counts, knights, and military commanders. Entire noble families had been exterminated in the male line, an entire generation of French military and political leadership had been annihilated in mere hours. English casualties, by contrast, were astonishingly light. While some English sources claimed under 100 dead, more reliable estimates put English losses at 400 to 600 men. Among the English dead were the Duke of York and the Earl of Suffolk, both killed in the melee. But compared to French losses, English casualties were negligible. Henry had achieved one of the most lopsided military victories in medieval history. An exhausted, starving, outnumbered army had destroyed a force 4 times its size. How did this happen? The convergence of multiple factors, all working in England's favour. The terrain, muddy, narrow, flanked by woods, neutralised French numerical superiority and mobility. The weather, heavy rain turning earth to thick clay, crippled French heavy cavalry and armoured infantry. The longbow, a weapon requiring lifelong training to master, gave English archers devastating ranged firepower that French crossbowmen couldn't match. English defensive tactics, the stakes, the wedge formations, the disciplined coordination between archers and men-at-arms turned a desperate defensive battle into a killing ground. But equally important were French mistakes. Their overconfidence led to poor tactical decisions. Their eagerness for glory created a disorganized piecemeal attack instead of a coordinated assault. Their decision to fight dismounted in heavy armour on muddy ground sacrificed their mobility. Their failure to use their superior numbers effectively, allowing themselves to be funneled into a narrow front, turned advantage into liability. And their underestimation of English longbowmen, treating them as inferior troops rather than the military professionals they were, proved fatal. The victory at Agincourt transformed Henry V's failed campaign into legendary triumph. The exhausted English army continued its march and reached Calais safely. Henry returned to England as a conquering hero, celebrated in the streets of London with lavish pageantry. The battle proved that England remained a major military power despite decades of setbacks in the 100 Years' War. It gave Henry the political capital and confidence to launch new campaigns into France. Within 5 years, he would force France to accept the Treaty of Troyes, naming Henry as heir to the French throne. For France, Agincourt was a generational catastrophe. The death of so many nobles created power vacuums across the kingdom. Entire regions lost their leadership class. The Armagnac-Burgundian civil war intensified as factions struggled to fill the void left by the slaughter. French military confidence was shattered. The myth of knightly invincibility had died in the mud at Agincourt. France would eventually recover and ultimately win the 100 Years' War, but that recovery would take decades and require the emergence of leaders like Joan of Arc to rebuild French morale. Agincourt also marked a turning point in medieval warfare. The battle demonstrated conclusively that heavily armoured cavalry, the dominant military force for centuries, could be defeated by disciplined infantry and archers using favourable terrain. The longbow, a relatively cheap weapon that commoners could master, had destroyed the mounted nobility that represented years of expensive training and equipment. The age of chivalry, already declining, was dealt a mortal blow. Future warfare would increasingly favour professional soldiers over aristocratic knights, massed firepower over individual prowess, and tactical innovation over traditional honour codes. The English longbow would dominate European battlefields for the next century, until gunpowder weapons eventually replaced it. But Agincourt remained the longbow's finest hour, the day when thousands of archers stood against impossible odds and emerged victorious. The battle entered English national mythology, immortalised by Shakespeare in Henry V the St. Crispin's Day speech. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," though written nearly 2 centuries after the battle, captured the spirit of that impossible victory. A small, exhausted, desperate army that refused to surrender and instead wrote one of history's most dramatic underdog stories. October 25th, 1415 began with 6,000 starving Englishmen trapped in mud, facing an army that should have crushed them without effort. It ended with the battlefield covered in French dead and King Henry V standing victorious over the greatest military upset of the medieval age. Agincourt proved that superior tactics, favourable terrain, and revolutionary weapons could overcome numerical superiority. It showed that the age of the mounted knight was ending and a new era of warfare was beginning. And it demonstrated that sometimes, against all odds, the underdog wins. The Battle of Agincourt remains one of history's most studied military engagements. Military historians still debate the exact numbers, the precise tactics, and the controversial prisoner, execution. But no one disputes the outcome. In just a few hours of brutal combat, English archers and men-at-arms destroyed French military power for a generation and changed the course of the 100 Years' War. It was a victory that shouldn't have been possible, but it happened in the mud of northern France on St. Crispin's Day, 1415. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic battles, there's more where that came from. Join our Patreon community to get early access to episodes, exclusive content, behind-the-scenes research, and direct input on future battles we cover. Your support helps us keep bringing you these cinematic historical documentaries. The link is in the description. Thank you to our existing patrons. You make this channel possible. And to everyone watching, hit subscribe, smash that like button, and drop a comment telling us what battle you want to see next. We'll see you in the next war. Until then, stay curious about history